let me ask you a question. Do you know this woman? Her name is Ursula von der Leyen. And I gotta confess, I'd never heard of her until about a month ago. And it's not just me, neither had most other Europeans. So this woman's about to become the next EU Commission president. She will be the equivalent of Donald Trump in the European Union, the most powerful person in Europe. And this is already official. On November the 1st, she will take the oath. And okay, I know what you're thinking, especially those of you who voted in the European elections. I mean, who is this woman? Where did she come from? Why her? Well, I think Eric can give us a bit more information.
Of course, Simon. As you know, on May 2019, Europeans went to the polling stations to choose the members of the European Parliament. These are legislative elections for the EU as a whole, and in many ways are similar to the midterms in the United States or the parliamentary elections in the UK. So the name of Ursula von der Leyen wasn't on any ballot. Back then, she was just the defense minister of Germany. Germans knew her, but other Europeans, not so much.
I know what you're thinking. This process is completely legal. In EU elections, Europeans don't get to choose the executive power, just the legislative one. So technically, anybody could become president of the Commission as long as the Parliament accepts him or her. In other words, this is totally possible law-wise, but politics-wise, it's kind of a bit weird. Just to give an example, many people in the UK complained about Bojo, also known as Boris Johnson, becoming the Prime Minister. But to be fair, Johnson is well known and he was a Member of Parliament. The situation with von der Leyen would be like choosing the Mayor of Liverpool as Prime Minister, just because. And yes, it's true, von der Leyen's appointment is a historical event. She will be the first woman to rule over Europe. Her name will appear next to other pioneers like Angela Merkel and Margaret Thatcher. And maybe she'll become a big historical figure just like them. She might even be a great president. But today's question is, can we say the European Union is a real democracy if von der Leyen was chosen without being voted in? What's the EU Commission's president's role? Well, today we are absolutely going to answer those questions. I mean, we always do, but before we do, we'll do what we always do as well, and that's take a look at the history.
The Brussels Bubble.
In the year 1992, the Maastricht Treaty was signed. We could say that this was the moment when the European Union, with its capital of Brussels, started. Until that moment, the European single market was only what the name suggested. A market. It was just this big old free trade agreement that included almost all of Western and Southern Europe, but it had almost no political power. The European Union was a giant step because it meant that now all of those countries would be bonded by a common government. Years later, creations like the euro currency, the Schengen area, and many other treaties were all possible. And you might be wondering, can we say that the EU is similar to the US? Does it work as a federation, as a confederation? Well, it's hard to say. In fact, European institutions are really a bit hard to understand. And usually the media, it doesn't really help with this. You often hear news saying like, Brussels said this, or Brussels demands that. But in fact, there are 3 institutions in Brussels, and all 3 are different from one another, and they all have different roles. But don't worry, you can understand it all very easily with an example that you all know about because it's been smashed over your head a dozen times, and that's Article 13. But just in case you didn't know, Article 13 is the common name for that EU copyright directive that affects YouTubers a great deal. Like I say, I'm sure you have absolutely heard about it many times. But this time, let's not focus on what it said, but instead, let's look at how it got passed. It all starts with the European Council. This is the place where the prime ministers of all the EU member countries come together and say like, all right guys, what we're going to do is we're going to need some sort of legislation to regulate online copyright, right? They all write some general guidelines and then they send it to the next dude, the European Commission. The Commission would sort of be the equivalent of the White House or Downing Street. This is the executive power in Europe. They have a president, a vice president, and some commissioners that are similar to a minister or a secretary of state. So these guys, they read the guidelines written by the council and they write a legislative proposal, which would be the first draft for legislation. Once they're finished with that, they send it to the legislative body, which is the European Parliament. This parliament works in a very similar fashion to the US Capitol or the House of Commons, but in the UK, it has something unique. Its members cannot come up with their own ideas. They can only discuss the proposals sent in by the Commission. For example, in the US, Ocasio-Cortez is only a congresswoman, but she can come up with a Green New Deal and try to make it pass through Congress. A European MP couldn't. This means that the EU Parliament is much weaker than a normal one. So coming back to that Article 13 thing, after the European Parliament discusses it, they come up with their own version of the law. But there are still so many details to polish. If you remember the video we made about Article 13, a small detail in a piece of legislation can change an entire industry. So this is where we get the trialogues. Trialogue is a process where representatives from those three institutions, the Council, the Commission, and the Parliament, they meet again and they discuss the law. And finally, we have the final, the polished, the discussed legislation. The final stage is when the trialogue sends this law back to the Parliament. In this case, the MEPs can vote yes or no, but they can't propose any more amendments. So, as we said before, in this system, the Commission has a lot of power because they are the only ones who can send a legislative draft to the Parliament. This is why this is such an important question. Who gets to choose the President of the Commission? And this is where the big debate starts. The President is chosen by the EU Council and ratified by the Parliament. That is, the Prime Ministers of all the EU countries get to decide who the President will be, and then the Parliament votes in favour or against. This leaves the Parliament in a very weak position because they can only say yay or nay, but again, they cannot propose anybody. And this is why 5 years ago some politicians proposed the Spitzenkandidaten system. In this system, each political party running for the elections must have one candidate for president. So, say if you vote for the Social Democrats, you know that they'll fight for this specific candidate to be the EU president. Sounds pretty fair, right? Well, there is a bit of a problem. Many political parties just don't agree with this. I mean, think about it. Right now, the council can choose anybody to be president. With this proposed system, the Spitzenkandidat thing, they can only choose from a very short list that's proposed by the parties. So for years, the Spitzenkandidat system became a sort of gentleman's deal. Parties kind of followed the system, but it wasn't really written down anywhere. This is how former EU President Jean-Claude Juncker was elected in 2014. He made his a coalition government between Social Democrats and the People's Party. And now you might be wondering, well, what happened during the 2019 election, Simon? Well, what usually happens with gentlemen's deals, some gentlemen just so happen to break them. In this case, the Social Democrats and the People's Party didn't have enough seats to make a government. They needed the support of the Liberals, and Liberals don't want the Spitzenkandidaten system. But why not? And why did they end up choosing the German defense minister? Well, let's have a look, shall we?
Spitzenkandidaten? Non merci.
In Brussels, they call it the EU top 5 jobs, the 5 most powerful political positions. Those positions are the President of the Commission, the Vice President who deals with foreign affairs, the President of the Parliament, President of the Council, and the President of the European Central Bank. These 5 guys opened a restaurant that serves burgers and no, they didn't. They're the ultimate decision makers in Europe. So the question is, who gets to choose them? And the answer is, again, the Council. And again, the Council is made up of the Prime Ministers of all of the member countries. Then they need the approval of the Parliament. With the Spitzenkandidaten system, they would have a bigger say in this because at least the parties can say who the eligible candidates are. So who's in favour of this? Well, of course, it's the biggest political parties. What a surprise! But who's against it? Well, think about it.
Macron's party rejects Spitzenkandidat process.
Macron, the French president, belongs to the Liberal Party, which is in the third group. In other words, Not a big deal. But as the president of the second biggest country in Europe, he has a strong position on the council. Basically, having the second largest economy in the Union gives you a lot of leverage to negotiate with the other countries. This is why usually we talk about the French-German axis. Those two economies usually, well, they lead the negotiations. So basically, Macron has a big incentive to keep the power of the council as it is now, and Germany, being the largest country in both population and economics, is pretty happy too. So at the end of the day, Macron and Merkel, they sat down together and they said, no Spitzenkandidaten. We choose a German Commission President and a French President for the European Central Bank. How about that? And since Germany and France have the most leverage on the council, the rest of the countries, they basically just said, amen, guys, amen. You guys, we have to. This is where Ursula von der Leyen came into the picture. Basically, she's the perfect poster child for the European. She's German, but she was born and raised in Belgium. She speaks 5 languages and has friends everywhere. Basically, she's the kind of charismatic person that everyone wants to hang out with at a cocktail party. So as soon as they introduced her to the members of the council accepted her. No surprise. And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, oh, come on, Simon, that can't be it. You see, when we try to make political analysis here at VisualPolitik, we often try to use things like, economic data and surveys and complex strategies to understand a politician's behavior. But we often forget the politics carried out by humans, like you and like me. So sometimes something as stupid as telling the right joke to the right person at the right cocktail party can drive big political decisions. In Europe, this kind of political maneuvering has a name. It's the Brussels bubble. So, who did they choose for the president of the European Central Bank? Well, in this case, it was a French woman, Christine Lagarde, the former IMF president. This is a great deal for Macron. He's killing 2 birds with 1 stone. He puts a French person in power and he makes sure Lagarde won't run against him. Smart move, Macron.
Christine Lagarde, France's dream president.
The rest of the top jobs went to Spain, Italy, and the Liberals. But let's be honest here, the biggest winners were Germany and France. David Sassoli, an Italian Social Democrat, will become the next EU Parliament president. Josep Borrell will become the vice president, and Belgium Liberal Charles Michel will lead the council. So, okay, the big question now is, well, what's the next step? How does Ursula von der Leyen get to choose the commissioners? Well, let's have a look.
Von der Leyen's team.
According to many surveys, the main reason why Britons voted in favour of Brexit was not regulations or immigration, but a lack of citizen control over EU affairs. And after everything we've said, we must admit that there is a little bit of truth to that. And you could say, oh no, the Parliament still could have rejected von der Leyen as president. Well, look at how people can change their opinion on the Brussels bubble. This is what the People's Party Spitzenkandidaten Manfred Weber said one day.
Weber urges EU lawmakers to push back against decisions made in diplomatic back rooms.
And look at what he said just a month later.
Germany's Weber urges EU lawmakers to back von der Leyen in top job vote.
So it doesn't seem to be a debate, at least not a transparent one that we can see in the Parliament. It seems that most of the decisions are made in a private room in that Brussels bubble. So now you might be wondering, well, what happens next? What can we expect from von der Leyen once she gets into office? The first thing she'll have to do is name the commissioners. As we said before, the commissioners are the equivalent of a minister or a secretary of state in the European Union. There must be 28 of them, 1 for each member country. That means, for example, that you couldn't have 2 Germans or 2 Italian commissioners. But of course, it's not the same thing being the commissioner in charge of finance, a very important spot, as being the one in charge of humanitarian aid. I mean, who really gives a shit about that nonsense? Am I right? No, I'm not right. It will be von der Leyen's job to decide who does what. So far, all we know is that the new governments of Europe will have priority between genders. There will be as many female commissioners as there are male commissioners. And this is where the EU Parliament has the biggest say, because right after von der Leyen names her commissioners, they will have to pass a test at Parliament.
And yes, those tests are not simple. It's common for some commissioners to not even pass them. For example, in 2014, the Slovenian candidate failed at the parliament's hearings, and so they had to choose another person from the same country. So yes, von der Leyen will not have it that easy. In this regard, one could see it as a very effective check and balance.
But now the question goes to you. Do you think Macron did the right thing by avoiding the Spitzenkandidaten system? Are the Eurosceptics right to complain about the lack of democracy in Europe? Well, please leave your answer in the comment section below. Also, visit our friends from reconsidermedia.com. That's the podcast that provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine. Also, we publish brand new videos every week, so subscribe to this channel, hit that bell button, like this video, all of that good stuff, and I'll see you next time.
And if you want to learn more about politics and hear even more of my lovely voice, you can join us at Reconsider Media. We have a podcast at reconsidermedia.com/podcast. See you there.